Hello, everyone. My name is Holly Ravensloot. I'm the branch chief for the Energy Policy and Evaluation Branch of the Office of Community Services, Division of Energy Assistance. On behalf of OCF, I would like to welcome everybody to today's webinar on LIHEAP Performance Data Quality, verifying the reliability of your data. Today's webinar is a result of a common question that grantees have asked. How do I know that my performance data is reliable enough to support making changes in my program design or policies? This is an important question, and the purpose of today's presentation is to help grantees with answering that question. Today's webinar will furnish you with information and new resources that have been developed by the Performance Management Implementation Work Group, also known as the PMIWG. We use that often. So the webinar will present a comprehensive framework that grantees can use for conducting data reliability assessment. The webinar will then highlight new tools to help prioritizing your review and assessment of data reliability, furnishing benchmarks that alert you to possible data reliability issues you may have, and to show you how to identify the sources of data reliability problems. The audience for this webinar are LIHEAP coordinators and program staff that want to use their data for performance management and program improvement, as well as IT and other staff that assist with collecting, reviewing, and processing performance data. Next slide, please. All right, thank you. All right, before we begin, it's important to review the background of the LIHEAP performance or program's emphasis on data quality. Obviously, the quality of our data is quite important on how it could influence us. OCS has a long history of working with grantees to ensure that quality information about LIHEAP is furnished to Congress, stakeholders, and the public. For many years, DEA staff actually took the responsibility for manually reviewing grantee reports to identify potential issues and assist grantees that face data reliability challenges. Manually, ouch. Anyway, more recently, DEA has implemented a number of steps to help grantees with conducting and improving data reliability. That includes, 1, conducting annual training webinars on completing required reports, including what data to collect, how to process it, and what common issues to check for. We've also added automatic data validations in OLBC to alert grantees to possible issues in their report prior to submission. We've also developed systematic data checking procedures and resources to help grantees check their reports. And finally, we have contracted with a prize to conduct detailed report reviews to provide in-depth technical assistance to grantees. All right, next slide. If you've been around for a little bit, you may remember at the beginning of federal fiscal year 2016, grantees began collecting and reporting new LIHEAP performance measures data on energy burden, targeting restoration of home energy service due to LIHEAP, and prevention of loss of home energy service due to LIHEAP. The performance measures provided the grantees with new data and results about their program impacts and outcomes. As grantees began to review and assess their results, the PMIWG established a data reliability team in 2018. The goals of this team are, 1, to provide case study examples of how grantees have examined and assessed the reliability of their data, 2, to develop a framework to assist grantees with understanding data reliability, and 3, to produce new tools to help grantees assess their data and determine if they are sufficiently reliable for making program decisions. OCS is very excited about this grantee-led effort to develop tools that can help ensure that the new performance management data is giving the grantees reliable data about how their programs are performing. We really hope you enjoy this webinar, and with that, I am going to turn it over to Melissa.
Thanks, Holly. So today's webinar is 90 minutes long, and we're going to spend the time first hearing about a data reliability case study from Montana. We're also going to introduce you to the data reliability guide that's a work in progress, but we're going to show you what we have developed so far. And I say we, meaning the work group members who have worked so hard on this over the last over a year. So this includes an overview of the data reliability assessment. There's a framework that we're going to show you. We're going to talk about how to set priorities when assessing your data reliability. And then David Carroll is going to go and demonstrate the data reliability assessment tool. You'll notice that the slides are available for download in the handout section in the sidebar of your GoToWebinar. And this webinar is being recorded and will be published on the ACF YouTube training channel. So today's speakers from the data reliability team include Jenny Sullivan from Montana, Lorraine Portis from Mississippi, Casey Latran from Oklahoma, and Kanisha Floyd from Tennessee. And we do have additional members on the team, and we'll make sure that all of their names and contact information are included at the end of the webinar. You'll also hear from members of the Apprise support team, including myself, Dan Bausch, David Carroll, and Kevin McGrath. You're encouraged to ask questions today like we normally do. Go ahead and type them into the question box on your GoToWebinar sidebar. Your submitted questions will be discussed at the end of each part of the webinar. So you can type them as we're going along, and the folks at Apprise will kind of compile them and make sure they're all asked at the end. You can also click the raise your hand button at the end of each part of the webinar during our Q&A sessions to be called on to ask a question over the phone. And I think we might have a handy graphic that we always show. This left-hand big white box is your kind of GoToWebinar navigator. You'll see the box there for asking a question. That's also where you're going to find your handouts. And then if the sidebar isn't showing for you, there's a little tiny, you should see this little blue rectangle, and you can just click the orange arrow, and that will expand it so that you get the full navigation pane. So like we normally do, we're going to ask you a poll. So hopefully y'all are quick on your feet and paying attention. And the question we're going to ask you first is, how confident are you that all of the data reported on Module 2 of your LIHEAP performance data form is complete and correct? So this is all your performance measure data. And the options are very confident, somewhat confident, not too confident, and not at all confident. Jorge will tell us when our time is up. You all should be wrapping it up. All right, so the results are here. We have 22% of you that feel very confident. That's great. Most of you fit in a somewhat confident category. 13% of you are not too confident, and 4% of you are not at all confident. So hopefully this webinar will begin to move you into looking into places and prioritizing places that you could improve your data reliability. So if we want to go to the next slide. We're going to talk now about how this kind of project kicked off, and with that, I'd like to introduce you all to Jenny Sullivan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Sullivan with Montana, and I'm a member of the data reliability team. One of the goals for this group is to provide examples of what other states have come across and the steps that they have taken to determine data reliability before making decisions. As a data reliability team, we decided to take a look at the LIHEAP performance measures data for each of the states in our group to see if there were any inconsistencies that might jump out at us. The data performance measures results for Montana seem to be a little off for propane benefits. But before making a decision to change policy, we wanted to dig into the data and verify its accuracy and reliability for decision making. For some background information on our initial analysis, we reviewed the FY 2016 data, where we had collected data for approximately 10,000 households in Section 5. We were able to get propane data for about 900 households. We were pretty certain that the data gathered was reliable and that we had produced the performance measures data accurately. We then delved into the data with Apprise using the executive summary and other tools that Dan is now going to walk through.
Thank you, Jenny. Hi, this is Dan Bausch at Apprise. So Jenny gave you some brief background. I'm going to walk you through what the questionable result was in Montana's report and how the data reliability team worked with Jenny to identify it. So first, the team started by looking at Montana's overall results for energy burden targeting. And the slide on your screen now shows those results using Montana's performance measures executive summary for fiscal year 2016. The executive summary is a one-page document that the work group developed to summarize each state's performance results and to show them visually. So there are two key questions about energy burden targeting results that are shown on the left-hand side in the gray box. The first question is, does LIHEAP furnish higher benefits to higher burden households? And the answer for Montana, as you can see in their summary, is yes. The average benefit for the high burden households was $194 higher, or about 33% more, than the average benefit for all households. On the right-hand side, you can also see this in the light blue circles. The one on the top shows the average overall benefit amount was $584 for all households, compared to the average benefit amount for high burden households being $778. The second question in the gray box is, does LIHEAP pay a larger share of the home energy bill for high burden households? And the answer for Montana is, again, yes. Across all households, LIHEAP paid 51.5% of the energy bill on average. But for the high burden households, LIHEAP paid a higher portion of the bill, 53.7%. So looking at Montana's overall results across all households, the team could see that Montana did provide higher benefits to the high burden households, and Montana paid a larger share of the home energy bill for households with the greatest energy burdens. But after looking at the overall results, the next step was for the team to dig deeper into the results and ask how they compare when you examine them by main heating type. Next slide. The next two slides are going to show charts from Montana's 2016 performance measures snapshot, which was a companion document to the executive summary that was shown on the last slide. And on this slide, the chart's showing three different items for each main heating source. First, the total dollar amount that's listed above each bar is the average total energy bill. Second, the amount in the blue portion of each bar is showing you the average total LIHEAP benefit that households for that fuel group received. And then finally, the amount in the red portion of each bar is the average net bill amount, which is the energy bill amount remaining after receiving LIHEAP. If you look at the right side of this chart, you'll see propane main heat households, and they're outlined in the red box. Propane households had an average energy bill of more than $1,500 a year. And if you look at the bar immediately to the left of them, fuel oil households, they had a similar energy bill amount. So both propane and fuel oil households were found to have higher energy bills than other fuel groups. And since both groups had similar average incomes, the average energy burden for each group was approximately the same. However, the red and the blue portion of the bars shows that the propane and fuel oil households had different outcomes after LIHEAP assistance. Based on Montana's data, you can see the fuel oil households received a benefit of $1,045 in the blue, but the propane households received a lower benefit amount of $630. So the result was that the net bill for fuel oil households after receiving LIHEAP was about $647, while the net bill for propane households was almost $300 higher. So the result was that propane households had the highest post-LIHEAP energy burden compared to the other fuel groups. Next slide, Jorge. On this slide, we're looking at a chart that focuses specifically on the high burden households in Montana. As a reminder, the high burden households are the top 25% of households that have the highest energy burden. And this chart's showing you energy burden percentage point change for each of those heating groups. If you look at this chart, the total amount listed above the chart and above each bar is the average energy burden before receiving a LIHEAP benefit. The propane main heat households in the rightmost bar had an average burden of almost 30% among this high burden group based on their average energy expenditures and their household income, which was higher than any other fuel group. The top green portion of the bar shows that the reduction in energy burden as a result of receiving LIHEAP, and the bottom lighter green portion of each bar represents the post-LIHEAP energy burden. If you compare across the fuel groups, you can see that after LIHEAP assistance, the high burden propane households had an energy burden of 17% compared to only 8.4% for fuel oil and 10.2% overall in the leftmost bar. Next slide, Jorge. So what do Montana's results tell the team, and what raised questions? Well, when they examined and compared results by main heating type, they found that before LIHEAP assistance, propane households had an average energy burden similar to fuel oil households. However, the performance measures results showed that the average LIHEAP benefit provided to the propane households was substantially lower than the benefit amount provided to fuel oil households. And so after LIHEAP assistance, the result was that propane households had a lower share of the bill paid by LIHEAP than fuel oil households. Propane households had the highest energy burden after receiving LIHEAP assistance. And those differences were the most pronounced for the highest burden propane households. So looking at these results, the conclusion of the team was that the data indicated that the propane households did not have an equivalent reduction in energy burden to the other fuel groups. And now Jenny will explain what questions this raised.
After seeing the data that Dan has just gone over, we were determined to further investigate and worked with Apprise to do this. There are three major questions for us to answer. Was the propane expenditure data we reported correct, or was there a data reliability issue? Was the LIHEAP benefit data we reported correct, or was there a processing or reporting error? And if we determined the reported performance data was correct, then we needed to review how we are determining propane benefit levels. Was this process reliable, or did we have a data quality issue? Next slide, please. For the first question, was the propane data we reported correct, or was there a data reliability issue? Did we collect the annual propane vendor from the propane vendors? Yes. Did we collect the annual electricity expenditure data for the same propane households? Yes. Did we process the data correctly to calculate the average expenditure amounts? Yes. To determine these yeses, we reviewed the data files received from the propane and electricity vendors for accuracy, making sure the data was loaded in the files correctly and the data we received was not outside the norms for each fuel type. For the second question, was the LIHEAP benefit data Montana reported correct, or was there a processing or reporting error? We went through and determined we accurately recorded the benefit amounts for each household, that we included all benefits the household received during the fiscal year, and that we did process the data correctly to calculate the average expenditure amounts. So to determine all of these yeses, we verified the data files for both the propane and electricity vendors were loaded correctly into the computer system. So the data we already verified earlier made it into the computer system correctly and was there. Then we reviewed and verified that the data was correctly used and processed to produce the LIHEAP performance measures data. Next slide, please. For the last question, we determined the performance data was correct So now we had to research our processes for creating our benefit matrix. Montana used we used projected propane prices for the upcoming winter to define propane benefit levels for subsequent fiscal years. Sorry, I'm not good at reading the bullets. Basically, we do a survey of vendors and ask them to tell us what they think the propane prices would be. That's how our benefit matrix was calculated. And these estimates are furnished somewhere between 5 and 10 vendors give us that data. And then we determined the projected propane data being used was not reliable. The analysis found that the projected prices were lower than the actual prices during the heating season and were not a reliable approximation for the actual propane bills. We had even gone a step further, and we actually divided the state up and worked with a prize, and each division across the state, there was a wide range of what the propane prices were, but they were all higher than the projected price. Okay, next slide, please. As a result of the analysis, Montana made the following change to their approach for determining propane benefit levels. For the initial change for FY 2018, we used a special process to provide additional supplemental benefits to our propane clients. And then for a long-term change, for FY 2019 going forward, we changed our policy for determining propane benefit amounts in our benefit matrix. We are now using the Energy Information Administration fuel price data for the Rocky Mountain region rather than projected future propane prices from a survey of vendors. Next slide.
Thank you, Jenny. So we're going to give folks an opportunity to ask questions of Jenny and Dan about the Montana case study. So remember, you can go ahead and enter it, type it in, or you can raise your hand, and Jorge will go ahead and unmute you so you can ask a question.
We have only one question so far. So I'm going to read it, and Jenny or Dan can answer. The question is, was Montana able to determine why the vendors' projected propane values were not closer to the actual bills that households had?
This is Jenny. I can answer that. We did do some researching, or reaching out to the vendors and got some analysis. They had to estimate prices for the coming winter, but propane prices, as we all know, change very quickly and they're hard to predict. In Montana, they vary a great deal by location, and we only survey a subset of the vendors every year. And for all these reasons, the projections were not a good approximation for the actual bills. And sometimes the last couple winters had gotten very cold, and the amount of propane available sometimes makes that prices vary too.
Do you have any additional questions, Jorge?
None so far.
Okay. As if you think of questions, go ahead and type them in. It's okay if you didn't ask it right away. You can ask it any time during the webinar. We're going to move into another poll. So once again, hopefully you all are focused on the screen. The second poll, we're going to ask you a question. How concerned are you? You know, Jenny just talked about the fact that in Montana, what they learned was that their data collection that they were getting and entering and recording was reliable, but the data they were actually getting from the propane vendors to use in their benefit matrix wasn't as accurate as it needed to be. And so how concerned are you that the data underlying your benefit matrix are not as accurate as they should be? Your options are very concerned, somewhat concerned, not too concerned, and not at all concerned. So Jorge will open up that poll, and then give us a heads up when we should be completing it. If you're one of those coordinators that falls into the I have no idea how my benefit matrix is computed, you might probably want to be very or somewhat concerned, just giving you all a hint. So among all of the folks that responded, what we see is that 8% of the folks were very concerned. The majority, or actually just under half, are somewhat concerned. 29% are not too, and 17 are not at all concerned. So that resonates with what we see in the network, so that's good. I'd like to turn it over to Lorraine Portis from Mississippi to introduce the next section of the webinar.
Thanks, Melissa. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll take you through the introduction to our data reliability guide that we're pulling together as the work group. And why is this guide important? And it gets to what we already said, is to make sure that we can trust the data that we provide. And to do that, we wanted to make sure that our grantees have, we have tools to use to get to the verification of our data, to make sure that we can rely on it. Jen took us, next slide, please. Jen took us through Montana's case study, and she took us through the series of questions that were asked and the process of elimination that they went through to make sure that the data was good. And really, that was the basis of our original plan, to utilize case studies to check data reliability. But when we stepped back and we really started to talk and discuss it, we realized that we needed to have a more broader and expansive approach. So we updated our plan and developed a systematic and more comprehensive approach to assessing the quality of the data to make sure that it was reliable. And the rationale for that is really, we want to make sure that when stakeholders ask whether or not the performance data is good, that we can clearly state clearly that it is based on these steps and processes that we went through to verify it, so that programmatic decisions can be made. And the approach that we did is really to look at the entire process of collecting and reporting your performance data. Next slide, please. And of course, when we look at this, there are challenges and questions that are asked, and multiple challenges with developing this approach. When we're really looking at it, we look at all of these different points of impact, all of these many different data elements, main heat and fuel, income, the benefit, and the files that come into play. How do we begin to approach, to even begin to look at this when we get so many different pieces that are coming in at different times from different places? And one of the primary things is at the very front end, it's looking at the intake process. How do we make sure that all of the different intake agencies that we have are coding that data correctly? What's on the application? How are we then taking that, entering it, or putting it on our intake forms and coding that? Additionally, when we start looking at our energy providers, a lot of them have different types of IT systems. How do we make sure they are giving us the right data? Some of them are large and they have very sophisticated systems. And when we were meeting with our energy providers last week, one of the executive director of the Propane Association for our state informed us that 95% of our propane providers are mom and pops, and their systems aren't as sophisticated, and a lot of times they're manually entering data. So how do we work with them to try to work together to try to improve that process? We look at another point of impact to the report, and it's internally for all of us. Some of us have dedicated IT staff, some of us don't. So how can we make sure that they understand what we're requesting, especially when we can be doing this at different times. We're only doing this once a month. Do we have it defined in our system? Do we know how to consolidate and compile the information? Making sure that we're pulling in the right data. We found in ours that we had some duplicate records that we had to take out as we're pulling all of this information in. And like I said, it becomes challenging. So what we needed to do and what we asked Melissa and the Price to help us as a team is to develop a systematic approach. And Melissa, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lorraine.
You're welcome.
So I want to start actually by reminding everyone what we say in trainings all the time, that we focus when we talk about performance management on these specific performance measures. But remember that when we do performance management, we're using all of the data that we collect, whether it be comments from people in the field to the information we're collecting in our system and reporting in the household report, for example. It's not just about this energy burden data. That being said, we're going to focus on the energy burden data today, and you'll notice that a lot of the pieces cross over with things like the household report. So I want people to understand that we're not just skipping over all of these other reports that could have data quality issues as well, but we are going to focus on this today. And so as Lorraine mentioned, when we think about energy burden portion of the performance measures for LIHEAP, we're looking really at 5 key data elements. So this is just a little refresher. We're looking at main heating fuel, which we've defined as the fuel the client says they use most to heat their home. We're also looking at annual household income. This is the gross income for households receiving bill payment assistance. And this gross income is also used in the household report to calculate poverty intervals. Total LIHEAP bill payment assistance. So this is the total amount of benefits during the target year. This includes all benefits rolled up. So if a person got heating, cooling, crisis, supplemental, any energy assistance benefits they receive would be included in this total bill payment assistance. Main heating fuel bill, this is the total amount billed for main heating fuel for a 12-month period. And electricity bill, the total amount billed for electricity for a 12-month period if electric is not the main heating fuel type. So that's a reminder of some of the key data elements. Now, for some of you, Price goes out and does a lot of visits, and we do a lot of one-on-one T&TA, and some of you can look at your form and immediately see an issue with one of these data elements. Others of you call us and you're like, I'm new, I have no idea that if what I'm looking at looks reasonable or right. And so what we did and what Lorraine was talking about was this overarching framework of being able to walk through different pieces of the data collection process to identify weak areas or areas that you could strengthen. And then David's going to talk in the next section about how to prioritize and hone in on areas that may be problematic. So if we look at the kind of I hate using this term, but 30,000 foot level view and looking for hot spots, there are really kind of 4 areas we're going to look. If you go to the next slide, Jorge. This framework includes 4 key steps in data quality or data reliability assessment. And those are defining, collecting, recording, and checking. And we're going to go into each of those and give some examples. So the first is defining. Are we clear about what data should be collected? So for those of you who are new, this is obviously your first step, right? You need to be sure that you understand what data is required at the federal level, and then compare that, and that's why it says review the OCS action, transmittal, and form instructions, and compare that to the data that you're actually collecting. So for example, income is an area where we see or get a lot of questions. Some of you out there allow benefit to be calculated or eligibility to be determined based on net income, or you include exclusions, or you kind of modify things before you determine whether they're eligible or not. However, the reporting requirements for both the household report as well as performance measures require gross income amount. And so this is a good example of where you as a state coordinator need to make sure that you have something in place to collect the federally reported data, or the federally required data, in addition to whatever your state may be using to determine eligibility. It's important that this information that you have, right, what you know needs to be collected and what that means is passed down to your subgrantees as well as your vendors. So one example we see a lot of is the main heating fuel piece. You as a state grantee may understand that the main heating fuel may not be where the benefit is applied. In many states, clients or households have an option to get their benefit applied to whatever heating source or bill they'd like to, regardless of whether it's their main heating source or not. You may understand that the federal reporting requirement is that you collect main heat regardless of whether you pay a benefit to that or not. But do your subgrantees who are actually collecting data in the field understand that? And so it's important that you're communicating data requirements to your vendors and subgrantees, and either through your vendor agreements and subgrantee agreements at minimum, but also through training and T&TA and discussion. I think the main heating fuel is the biggest example. There's a lot of confusion in the field, you know, as you're doing an intake, to make sure you're asking the client the right question and making sure that you're recording it correctly. And so it's very important that your folks in the field, if you do use subgrantees, or even if you just use satellite offices, that they understand why you're collecting the data so that they're asking the questions in the right way. If you go on to the next slide, this is about collection. And we talk about, are we collecting the best possible data for each household? And there are really kind of two pieces that I think come into play here. People assume we're automatically talking about the IT system, but you know, when we go out and do a visit, right after we look at the policy manual and, you know, how you've defined income and how you've defined main heating fuel and whether that's being communicated well to grantees, we look at your application. And we go out there and make sure that your application is asking the questions of households in a way that they can actually answer it. So if you ask main heating fuel as a client, you know, dollars to donuts, I'm going to tell you where I want my bill paid, not necessarily what my main heating fuel is. So are you giving people space on the application to be able to report not just what their main heating fuel is, what they use most to heat their home, but also where they want their bill paid if that's an option. Many of you also allow if you have subgrantees, you allow your subgrantees to customize their applications. So when you do that, are you making sure that they're collecting the minimum needed to report on federal reports, but also doing it consistently with their sister agencies? So in states that allow customized applications that get good data, what they're doing is making sure that there's a minimum boilerplate that each subgrantee kind of has to meet, and that's outlined in the subgrantee agreement, or they actually approve customized applications before they're allowed to use them at the local level. And then one more issue that we've seen in the field, actually two, there are folks that are tied in with TANF and food stamps and other big social service programs, and you use that application to also deliver a LIHEAP benefit. It's really important for you to make sure that you have whatever supplemental information is needed to actually report on LIHEAP reports. So for example, if you're doing a food stamp application, when the data is entered or when the data is put in the application, is it being filled in such a way that LIHEAP can get the gross income, regardless of whether food stamps uses that gross income amount or not? Are you getting an accurate household member count, for example? You know, there are all kinds of pieces where things might be different between programs, so making sure you get the program what you need for LIHEAP specifically is important. We also pretend to be clients. I haven't gotten to go wear a mustache and go out to the field yet. I really would like to do that, but no one lets me. But I do, when we sit down with folks and have them move through an application in their system. In fact, I just went to Vermont. I'm not sure if they're on, but they actually made me fill out an application, and it was a really useful exercise because I didn't understand all the questions. And so I encourage you to take a look at your application and make sure that you're asking, once again, the questions in a way that the client can actually fill it out and understand what you're asking. If you want to go on to the next. So recording, this is about IT. And I'll tell you what, some of this is about training, making sure that you're going through and that people know how to enter data, and also looking at your data entry system. As I mentioned, we go out to the field and we have people walk us through the process from application through reporting, and walk us through their system. And the biggest thing that we do is look for fields. Are all the fields even there that you need to collect required data? And so some of the things that we see in the field are that there are missing fields. So for example, in a couple states recently, we've noticed that people aren't asking the account status at the time of application. So are they shut off? Are they almost out of fuel, whatever, and that makes it hard to do prevention and restoration data. We also see people who may not have the electric account information. So they're only asking for the account information for where the bill is being paid instead of all of the information for both main heating, fuel, and electric, regardless of where the bill is being paid. I think that a surprising issue we see, and a lot of you who use intake workers, who use a system, don't sit down very often and watch an intake worker go through a process. And when you do, it's very enlightening, because what you see is that there are sometimes missing fields, sometimes fields that are not being used or completely misinterpreted. And if those exist, what you get is a bunch of different offices and intake workers using those fields differently. And so you end up getting inconsistent data, or data that doesn't quite match across either agencies or even sometimes within an agency. And so it's really important that you occasionally take some time to make sure that you don't have a lot of excess fields in there that no one's using that could be accidentally filled in or used, and that the fields that are there are very clear and understandable. In the last few visits that we've done, we know that some states have not yet required electric account information in addition to main heating fuel information. Even though that's a required reporting element, they have the fields in their system, but they don't require the subgrantees to fill it out in case clients are in an emergency situation. They don't want to have to require them to go back and get an electric bill, in order to process the benefit. We recommend, highly encourage you to have that be a required field, but in those states where you absolutely are not going to do that, we have sat down with the state and actually looked at reports that show which agencies are actually providing that data and which ones aren't, so that those that are not getting electric household or account information from each household, TNTA can be targeted toward them. And in some states, it might even be a monitoring finding. So it may not be a required element in the system, but it is a finding if you don't provide it. And so there are mechanisms in place to be able to occasionally look at missing data or required data checks, and look across agencies to see which agencies are complying with that requirement or not. It's one of the pieces you'll notice here is that recording isn't just about entering and tracking, but also retrieving data. And so this is the piece that Lorraine talked about, where not all of us are IT people, but it is important, and not all of us have dedicated IT staff. So it's important that we look very carefully at whatever specs or whatever elements we're giving our IT folks to be able to pull the data and make sure we're checking that they're doing it right. Some common mistakes that we see in the area of income, for example, are a lot of you only require 30 days of income to be entered into the system, and then the system in the background kind of calculates an annual income. But we've seen IT folks actually only pull 30 days of income when they go in to do the performance measures report. And so obviously some of you would see that and see that that's very low and be able to call it. Some of you may have high zero income household counts, and if that's the case, you may just think it's a very low number. So it's important to make sure that they understand how to pull the data, and we have lots of tools out there to help you communicate with them, and then of course we're there to help you communicate as well. And then finally, checking, and this is my favorite because I think that there are many ways that we can get out there to actually see what some of the issues are. One of the things you're going to hear from David shortly, and one of the things that I want to make sure you hear from me as well, is that there's no silver bullet out there. And that's what this team, Lorraine said that they struggled a little bit to come up with a tool. There's no tool on the planet that we can give you, well, maybe there is, but there's no tool that we can give you that can tell you exactly where your issue is. But what we can do is maybe raise some red flags, right? And say, oh, wait, you need to hone in on this particular area or focus in this particular data element that just doesn't seem quite right. And you don't have to wait for us to do that. You all can be looking at it. So are there ways during your monitoring that you could be checking for anomalies? I already mentioned this, but we sat with Vermont a couple of weeks ago, and we actually looked at which of their sub-grantee agencies were not providing electric information. And we found that most of them were, but there were one or two agencies that were disproportionately just not filling it out. And so that suggests it's more of a policy issue than a kind of individualized client issue. And so they know then by just running that report, either having it canned or just doing an ad hoc query in their system or asking their IT person to do it, they're able to see pretty quickly which agencies are following the policy and which ones are not. Also having information validation, so value ranges and consistency checks. So for example, if someone enters an income that's so astronomically out of this world impossible, it would check it. If you see people with an energy burden greater than 100%, it's checking that and making sure that the IT person is coding that incorrectly. It also means digging in. So remember when Jenny said, okay, we could see that there was an issue with the propane counts, and so we dug in, and we didn't just look at the numbers they were giving us, we looked at it across regions. One of the issues that just sticks out in my head, and I know Heather won't mind me putting her on the spot, but in Missouri, we just went there, Missouri, I should say, we just went there, and one of the things we saw is that they are getting a tremendous amount of cooperation from their vendors. So we noticed that they served, I'm just going to use some fake numbers here, they served 10,000 natural gas households, but they were only getting 2,000 cases to report in their performance data form with complete data. And so our first assumption was, are you actually getting the data from the vendors back? Yes, we are. What's the issue? And we went through each piece. They're getting the data. They're reporting it correctly. And when we dug into the data, what we saw was that in Missouri, and I think even in some other Southwest states, many people don't use their natural gas in the summertime. And so you would have these cases where you would see, 6 months of bill, 3 months off, and then another 3 months on. And so the account holder was there for 12 months, and it was 12 months of data, but because there were those zeros in the middle, their IT team did the right thing, exactly what they've been instructed to do, and threw those households out of the data set. So upon further looking at that, now they're going to say, okay, let's look at this and see if this is a phenomenon and maybe find a different way to make sure these households are included, even though they have 3 months with no usage because they've voluntarily gone without natural gas. So it's about, checking is about identifying and preventing data errors. And the only way to really do that is to dig in to your data and take a look at it and then come up with ways to mitigate that, either through validations in your system, through training, through monitoring, as well as through coming up with alternative ways to calculate data, as Missouri did. So this is an overarching view, and Jorge, if you want to go on to the next slide, we're going to pull up the data reliability guide. I'm going to show you the pages 1, 2, and 3. This is really this overarching piece that we're talking about, and David's going to dive in a little bit more, but you'll see that this first page is why it's important to look at look at your data reliability, some common problems you're going to see with main heating fuel expenditures. And then if you go down a little bit, what we're doing is developing a comprehensive way for you all to begin moving through elements of your program to strengthen your data. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see that there's 4 boxes right here. So defining means looking at your model plan, understanding it, making sure state local policy manuals are consistent with the model plan, looking at your subgrantee and vendor agreement. So do they all line up? Are they all consistent about what they're asking? And then is that consistent with federal reporting requirements? Collecting information, this is what are all of the ways that you get information and data about your clients, your client application forms, your intake procedures, your vendor data exchanges. Are all of the definitions and policies and procedures able to be fulfilled through your collection process? Or is it making it hard? Are there not enough fields? Are there too many fields? Recording, how are you using IT systems? Are there missing fields in the IT system? Are there required or fields that don't need to be required, or vice versa? Are there fields that people are just skipping over because they're in a hurry, but that you really need to be able to comply with reporting requirements? And then when you do get reports out of your system, are they right? Are the specs right? Are you able to look at them and say, oh wait, you guys aren't annualizing income, or you're overcounting zero income households, or whatever the case may be. And then checking, how are you looking at all the data and finding ways to make things pop off the screen? So if you, for example, are not getting a lot of electric account data, is it something happening across all of your offices, or are there 1 or 2 offices in particular that just don't want to collect that data or aren't even trying? Are there validations in place so that if people do misenter data, for example, they say the main heating fuel is electric, but then they enter a natural gas vendor. Is your system set up to kind of say, alert, alert, this might actually be a natural gas main heat household? Are people being trained correctly, and is there monitoring in place to be able to catch those things when it happens? So there are several resources that you can reference and questions that you can be asking, and that's what this next page is. It kind of gives you what we walked through in the slides. Here's some places to start looking when you want a more overall comprehensive look. But what we're going to talk about next, Casey and David are going to take over kind of here, and we're going to talk about some ways that this group is brainstorming and apprised as well in helping you all hone in on places in your data that need to be strengthened. So I'm going to have you go back to the, and we're going to ask for questions at this point. David, do you have something?
No, I do not.
Okay. Jorge, do you have any questions that have come in?
Yeah, there are a few questions that came in. Also one that came in about the last block after we closed the question, so I'll leave that one for the end. But I'll read the first one that has to do with what you were just talking about, Melissa. And it's, my state doesn't collect or record the data directly. The subgrantees do that, and we also rely partly on other programs. Are there any resources to help us with checking if they're collecting or recording properly? It is really hard to know by looking at the reports alone.
So we've worked with states that and gone in to make sure that there are tools to help subgrantees collect consistent information. So we talked, for example, about subgrantee agreement language, going in and making sure you have minimum data collection requirements and minimum reporting requirements. But I mean, there are a few states out there that can back this up that we've worked with who would just get an aggregate household report or an aggregate set of performance measures And what those folks have learned really quickly is that it's really important to get raw, I'm calling it raw data, but household level data from your sub-grantees if they're all collecting it differently or collecting it themselves. And we do have templates we can give you and even help you to kind of go through that. But without that, it's going to be really tough for you to see where the particular issues are, which agencies are not collecting which fields, for example. And so, you know, if you're a state that's in that position, we've helped other states with that, and we'd be happy to help you too.
Okay, the next question is, you're talking about the energy burden measures, but what about the restoration and prevention measures?
So as I mentioned, and I think Holly mentioned too, this is a work in progress. And so the first piece of work that's been done is really focused on energy burden measures. But for those of you who've worked with us in the field, you know we have tools for restoration prevention, and that will be folded into this assessment in short time.
And then the last question about this block is, I know that a price checks the reports for issues. Is this the same thing or is this different?
So remember how I mentioned that there's no silver bullet. So the checks that a price does are high level, and they look at things that are inconsistent or that just don't seem right, and they'll bring it up to you. But they're not going to get to see unless you're working with them closely or have asked them to help, they're not going to have that data necessary to dig down and find out what exactly it is that's causing that particular error. They can give you some ideas, but it really is about kind of giving you and alerting you to concerns that you might want to dig in deeper, and you can use this framework as one way to kind of tackle that.
Okay, and there is one more question about the last block. So this is probably for Dan or Jenny. And the question is, EIA data for propane generates price information at the state level. Could this be used instead of the entire mountain region?
This is Jenny, and it probably could. I'm not positive on the decision behind why they used the region instead of the state level. I could probably get back, or a prize might be able to send some further information on that.
David or Kevin, do you have any further insight on that question?
Hi, this is Dan. Yeah, the EIA data really varies depending on the state, but there's lots of different options. So it really just depends, I think, on your state and what specific fuel type you're talking about.
And so, you know, we're going to say this throughout, we always do, but if you need help kind of figuring that out or sluicing that out, that's something that prizes are very good at. So you're welcome to contact us and we can help with that. If there are no more questions, I want to make sure we have enough time for the next section. And so I think I'm turning it over to Casey to do an introduction.
Great.
Oh, wait, I'm doing a poll first. Sorry about that. So we just talked about this framework, this idea of defining, collecting, recording, and checking. So when you think about the area where you may need the most assistance or where you maybe could get stronger or improve, what is most likely to be the biggest problem for you or your state? Defining the data, collecting it, so that's about the application and getting stuff from vendors, recording it, so that's using your IT system to collect, track, and retrieve information, or checking, so that's going in after the fact and making sure the data is correct and valid. you guys should be wrapping up, or you all should be wrapping up. Interesting. Okay, so the 25% of you said defining what should be collected is a challenge. 45% of you said collecting the data, so making sure you're getting it consistently from households and your subgrantees and whoever is actually out there collecting the information, as well as vendors, I imagine. Recording it, so that's using your IT system to collect, track, and retrieve data. Only 5% of you found that to be an issue, whereas about another quarter of you said that checking, so being able to look at the data and make sense of it and say, is there a problem here, and what can we do about it, and being able to do that on a systematic way. So that's really helpful for us as we develop training materials and tools. So thank you all for participating in that. I'm going to turn it over now. Casey, are you ready?
Yes, thank you, Melissa.
Right. No problem.
Hi, everyone. I'm Casey. I'm with the Data Reliability team. Melissa have gone over the framework, and oh my God, I don't really know about you, but I'm Holly can stay on top of everything to ensure our program would be in compliance and meet the minimum requirement, let alone to have any time to access whether the data we collect is reliable for us to make any program decisions. I'm so overwhelmed, I don't even know where to begin. What should I do first? Next, please. So, Melissa talking about the 5 data elements. So I really don't know where to begin, whether I need to looking at the main heating, or should I start with income, or what about bill assistance, heating fuel expenditures, and the electric expenditures? And then not only that, what type of data reliability issue I may find? Is it about defining, or is it about the issue with my data collecting, or even with the way my data recording, or did my IT staff even do their diligence and checking on the data? So now we not only have 5 data elements and 4 data reliability issue, that's 20 different things to look into. I'm so overwhelming and so confusing. So what our data reliability team would recommend for us to do is you should take a look at the comprehensive approach. Do as much as you can with the resource you have, whether it can be the way you collect the data, or the term you define, or maybe the way you record your data. You don't have to do everything at once. You can make the assessment and utilize the resource you have now and make the change or correction over time. Then you can lay out a roadmap and focus on what can you do with the resource you have at the moment. Make priority to work on the data that your staff may not pay attention or maybe miss something. So anyway, I'm going to turn over to David, so David can go a little bit more detail.
Hi, Jorge. Can you let me know if you can hear me? We did a sound check before the webinar, but my phone died in the middle of the webinar, and I had to call on a different phone.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. So Kevin McGrath and I are gonna talk about the rest of the data reliability guide, as well as the data reliability assessment tool. And there are 3 features to this approach that we have been developing in terms of our TNTA for grantees over the last year or 2, as we've been trying to find things that are really help you to dig in and get the information you need. First, we always want to make sure we document what is recommended and why. So we put that into the guide. Second, we want to build tools that empower you with data that you might not already, that you probably don't have, so that we're going to give you some information that can help you with these issues. And we can specify some procedures that if you had, as Casey said, if you had more time to sit down and reflect, you certainly would be able to think these up yourself. But we're giving you a list of procedures that you can walk through. And then finally, we're developing a tool that gives you a place to record what you have learned. As Casey said, you only have a certain amount of time. Maybe you're going to work on this issue this month or this quarter. We're giving you a place to record that so that you don't lose it when you suddenly have to turn your attention to the next crisis that comes knocking on your door. And we know how that can happen. So the first thing is that you already answered a question about which types of data you think are the biggest issue for you, and which part of the process is important. So make use of that. So, what do we recommend that you do first? We recommend that you do what you're most concerned about. I apologize for putting up the label prize recommendations. When you work for one organization, you're used to doing this, but these are really the PMIWG recommendations. In order, as a team, we agreed to recommend main heating fuel expenditure, look at first at main heating fuel expenditures, then at electric expenditures, then household income, main heating fuel, and LIHEAP bill payment assistance. And at one level of this, at one end of the spectrum, main heating fuel bill, that's the data element that's the newest to you, and that is the most, I would say, the most important new data element that you need to develop an understanding of. And you might not have that much information about what is a reasonable main heating fuel bill. And so we're going to give you some guidance on that. At the other end of the spectrum is LIHEAP bill payment assistance. And it is a little bit of a challenge because we're asking you to count up all the different sources of payment assistance that goes to one individual client in terms of the reports. But since that is part of the nature of your audits, you get to ask lots of questions about bill payment assistance, and so you probably have greater experience and greater ability to work with that. And then the second thing is that we've developed this assessment tool, and Kevin's going to talk about that directs you to the areas where you might have problems. As Melissa said, the data guide and the assessment tool help to alert you to specific problems you may have with your data. Next slide, Jorge. So first I'm going to show you the data reliability guide, the setting priorities section, where we document why the team recommended that you do what you do. And then we'll move on. Kevin will talk about the assessment tool and give you an example of how that works. Jorge, can you show us the data reliability guide? So, we start with an overview, then we give you a framework for understanding your data, and then we talk about the data reliability assessment tool that helps you to set priorities. Again, there's a recommendation there on what should be done in what order. And we agree that you should conduct a comprehensive review if you can, but if you need to focus, the team recommended that you focus on the main heating fuel bill first. But then the next step, go back to the slides. So we say, what specific steps do I need to take? And Kevin's going to talk about, back up one sec. The data reliability, okay, sorry, next slide. Kevin's going to talk about the data reliability assessment tool and just give you an example of what the overall reliability assessment tab looks like. Kevin?
Thanks, David. So the data reliability assessment tool, if you were able to attend the national training earlier this year, you might be familiar with the performance management assessment tool, and it's built off of that same concept to where we have several tabs in an Excel workbook, and each tab gives you guided exercises for you to work through different topics, and in this case, related to data reliability. So the data reliability assessment tool has 5 tabs. There's an overall reliability, which scratches at the surface of each of the more detailed topics that are contained in the other 4 tabs. Next slide. So I'm going to briefly show you what the overall reliability assessment tab looks like. Like I said, it touches upon each of the 4 areas of data quality that we were talking about earlier, defining, collecting data, recording data, and checking your data. So Jorge, if you could give me screen control, I'll pull up the tool to show everybody. Okay, are you seeing my screen now? Okay, great. So the tool that we're looking at has some information that's pre-populated for you and some information that you would enter yourself using either your performance measures report or other information about your program that you're collecting from the energy vendors. So one data element that you may not be familiar with or may not have used in the past are the state energy data system average expenditures from the Department of Energy. So that's something that we've pre-populated for every state in the tool. So at the top of the tool, there's the ability to toggle between states. And if you choose a new state, the numbers will automatically update and pull in, what the average expenditures are from the SEDS for your state. And then as you walk through the tool, you enter the information from your performance measures report and other program materials. And the tool will do a check against, in this case for assessment 1, we're looking at whether the computed average expenditures from your performance measures report make sense compared to what we know from the SEDS. So in Pennsylvania, for example, we have an average expenditure for electric main heat of $1,470 according to the SEDS. If we calculated on our performance measures report that the bill was $2,500, that would get flags because the bill that we calculated is much higher than the bill that the SEDS is indicating for the state. In this case, it's 70% higher than the SEDS average bill. But if the bill we calculated was much closer, say $1,500, it wouldn't be flagged. The bills are fairly well aligned, and we wouldn't be too concerned that there's a data reliability issue for the electric main heating fuel. And it works the same way for each of the other main heating fuels. If you had a natural gas bill of $1,600 on your performance measures report, the tool would flag that for you and say you might want to look into this particular value and do some digging in. Similarly, assessment number 2 is about data collection. It asks you to complete information on the number of vendors in the state and the number of vendors for which you're receiving data on LIHEAP clients. So for example, let's say we had 8 vendors for electric in our state and we collected data from 5. Well, that meets what the recommendations are, which is to collect the data from the top 5 electric vendors in the state. But what if we only collected electric data from 3 vendors? Well, that would flag you there to say, you might want to dig in and see if the vendors you're not collecting electric data from should be included. And as we work our way down into the tool, there's other assessments here. We would be looking at whether we're recording and processing data for enough clients. So let's say that we had 10,000 overall electric main heat clients, and we got data for only 1,000 of them. So that's 10% of our electric main heat clients for whom we receive data. well, that would be flagged to draw your attention to that and say, well, what about those other 9,000 electric main heat clients? Are they different from the 1,000 that we were able to collect data? What if, however, we received data for 8,000 electric main heat clients? Well, we wouldn't be flagged there because that's pretty good coverage, getting 80% of the clients with data to report on. And the last assessment that's in this overall reliability tab asks you some questions for data checking routines and things to think about. If you're answering these questions and the answer is no, or it's a low percentage, it would be something to dig into on the other 4 tabs that are specific to that topic. I'll give Jorge the screen again. So the tool is really set up to give you a guided approach to assessing the reliability of your data, and it's meant to be used in conjunction with the guide that David and Melissa have been showing. So I'll turn it back over to David, I believe, who will talk a little bit more about that guide.
So the last thing is that what we're doing. So as I said, we're giving you some recommendations. We're giving you some benchmarks, and Kevin showed you how you'll get those. And then we're also giving you a place where you can record this information. So if you go back to the data reliability guide and go down to the next page, so what we're going to do is we're going to this is going to become a fillable PDF, and what it'll allow you to do is once you do an assessment, you don't want to lose that information. So the first thing is you've completed the overall reliability assessment, and you can enter in here whether you have any alerts for defining data requirements, for data collection, for recording and processing, or for data checking. And similarly, as Kevin said, that for main heat expenditures, there'll be 5 different tabs on that assessment tool. And step 2 will be, what did you learn from completing the defining data requirements for? Step 3, next page, Jorge, will be, what did you learn from completing the data collection form? So this gives you the opportunity to write all that down. And then finally, if you go to the following page, we give you a place to actually record what is your action plan. So as you've gone through each of these assessments, what is the next thing that you plan to do to try to improve the reliability of your data? And so this has, what we've put together here is a comprehensive guide that is both a guide to tell you how to do this, and it's also it's a document that you can actually record what you find as you take each step, and so that you can maintain that information. So go back to the presentation, Jorge. So we talked about recording the overall reliability assessment. You can enter the information you learned. Next page. And we talked about there's a data reliability action plan where you can write specifically what you're going to do to improve each of these for the main heating fuel expenditure data element. And there'll be 5 of these action plans, that you would come up with for the 5 different data elements that Melissa and Casey have described. Next. And so what are our next steps? As Holly and Melissa said, this is a work in progress. So the energy burden data reliability guide, the format is going to be a fillable PDF that allows you to create a permanent record. We're going to continue development of it, and we're going to post it on the performance management website by October 15th. And at that point, you can start using it. We're also going to be building the energy burden data reliability assessment tool. We're going to continue the development of that and post it on the performance management website no later than 10/31. And then, as Melissa said, we will be developing a similar guide and assessment tools for restoration and prevention. And the target date for that is 12/31. Next. But I think what you might be asking is, well, this is a nice introduction, but there's a lot more to learn about how to do this. Here's the process of making sure that these materials work. The data reliability team members are going to work with us to test the procedures. We are also going to be doing some beta testing with people who haven't been part of this process. So anybody who got on the website, on the webinar today, will send you an email and ask you the question, would you like to be part of the beta testing group? And then finally, as we've done with other tools, we're going to develop a tutorial that'll demonstrate step by step how to use these materials. But we really want to do the testing with the work group and the testing with the beta testers before we write out a tutorial, because that'll tell us, when we do those testing, that'll tell us what's not clear. So finally, we're going to turn, next slide, we're going to turn over to Kenesha Floyd, who is from Tennessee, who is relatively new to the work group and to the data reliability team, as kind of an independent to furnish an independent assessment of what she sees, because she wasn't part of this group at the beginning, and she's now coming into it and is giving us some good insights about it. Kenesha?
We need to unmute Kenesha.
Jorge, so act as if she raised her hand. Jorge, can you tell us if this is working?
Yeah, I am not able to unmute her.
Okay. Well, we'll let you know that Kenesha has been a valuable member of the team, and that she's been through this. You know that there were NIADA visits and there's been a prize visit, and she worked with Melissa on the NIADA visit, and they had a pretty good experience. And she has told us that she's pretty happy with this systematic approach, because these data are all new to them, and they're looking forward to working on that. Why don't we move on to the questions? Next slide, Jorge.
All right, Jorge, do we have any questions? We have just a few minutes.
Yeah, we do. We have one question that says, what would be involved in beta testing? I'm interested, but how much time and effort is needed?
So the beta testing would be, with the beta testing, we would try to limit we would only use as much of your time as you have available. I do think that what would happen is probably we would have one meeting a week for about an hour over 4 weeks. And in the first meeting, we would meet with you and talk about what you'd like to check. And we'd specify a couple of pieces of data we'd like you to gather. At the second meeting, we'd have you tell us what you found. At the third meeting, we'd recommend maybe a deeper dive for a specific item. At the third meeting, we'd review that. And then at the fourth meeting, we'd work with you on the development of an action plan and get your feedback on the tool and whether it works.
And there's another question.
Actually, Jorge, let's go ahead and go to the final polls, and that way we'll be able to end on time.
So we'll make sure we answer questions by email. If you ask them, how likely are you to look at least one data quality issue in the next 3 months after this webinar? And so your options are very likely, somewhat likely, somewhat unlikely, and very unlikely. All right. So 67% of you are very likely to look at least one data quality issue, and the rest of you are at least somewhat likely. So that's great news. What we're going to show you next in the webinar are some contact information and resources.
Actually, Melissa, we have one more poll.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Oh, we didn't have one more. Oh, there you go.
And then for which data element are you most concerned about data reliability? We appreciate your participation in this one, especially it helps us to get new tools and materials. The elements, of course, are main heating fuel, income, bill payment assistance, so this is the annual benefit, main heating expenditures, and electric expenditures. Main heating fuel and main heat expenditures are the top two, followed by electric expenditures and annual bill payment assistance, followed by income. So that's really helpful for us to know as we create tools and checks for all of you. As I was saying before, you're not in this alone. OCS has a contract with the prize so that we can help you with whatever steps you'd like to take as you assess your data reliability, whether it's moving through this tool or if you're already started work on something. We're happy to help. Jorge, if you pull up the slides, we'll show you the contact information. This is the data reliability team. So these are your peers, with the exception of Peter Edelman, who works at the Office of Community Services. He's an active part of this team. The remainder are other state grantees, Jenny, Lorraine, Sherry, Casey, and Kanisha. And they all have included their contact information, as well as the folks on the Apprise team. All of our contact information is also listed there below, and we encourage you to get a hold of any one of us to ask questions about this webinar or about data reliability in general. And we thank you for attending. If you do have questions, we'll stay on the line for just a couple of minutes, and we'll also make sure we send you answers to your questions if you put them in the chat box. Thank you for attending. Hope you all have a great rest of the week.
So Jorge, there was one more question?
One challenge that we have is that we rely on others to process the data, and it is hard to find if something is wrong as a non-IT person. It sounds like the guide will help with detecting problems with processing. Is that correct?
What the guide will do is it will help to alert you that there might be a problem. For example, the issue that Melissa talked about from Missouri, where they were reaching out to vendors, and they were for natural gas, and they were getting data back for maybe 4,000 of the 5,000 natural gas clients, but then the report only reported on 2,000 of them. That alerted them to the problem that, well, there were 2,000 households that the natural gas vendor sent back, but that weren't being put into the report. Why was that? And they were able to track it down and find out that those were households who actually went without service for a certain part of the year. And the data and the IT department decided that it was appropriate that wasn't 12 months of data. Now that was a perfectly reasonable assumption, but that alert allowed Missouri to do a better job to decide exactly what they wanted to include in their report. And I think that they're deciding they want to include those households that go part of the year without the service. Anything you want to add to that, Melissa?
No, I mean, they're just going to they're going to spend a little bit of time looking at that, and they're also going to call the natural gas company just to find out what their take on the issue is, if it's common or not, and just kind of talk with them to try and understand it a little bit better.
Any other questions, Jorge?
Will the assessment tool have instructions on how to use it?
That's what I was saying. So, Jorge, back up to the next steps. Sorry. Just go back a couple slides. So one of the things that we are going to develop a tutorial, and the tutorial is, if you've gotten into the data warehouse, you know there's a tutorial on how to use the data warehouse, and it walks you step by step through each thing you might do to get some information out of the data warehouse. We're going to be developing a tutorial for the data reliability guide that will follow the same path. But as I said, we really want to spend the next month or two doing some beta testing so that we understand what people don't understand about how to use the tool. So yes, there will be a tutorial. It will be done before the end of the year. And anybody who wants to start working on it right away, if you volunteer to be a beta tester, we'll help you walk through the process.
We have no more questions.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We appreciate you attending today, and we hope that this was useful. And I just want to, again, talk about how important it is that your colleagues who are on the work group, and in particular on the data reliability team, have done a really important job in helping to answer the fundamental question of how do I know my data are reliable enough to use them for performance management. Thank you very much.
Thank you.